The example of patient suffering is in itself the most precious of all lessons to an impatient world. Sherlock Holmes in The Veiled Lodger. "What is the meaning of it, Watson?" said Holmes solemnly as he laid down the paper. "What object is served by this cycle of misery and violence and fear? It must tend to some end, or else our universe is ruled by chance, which is unthinkable. But what end? There is the great standing perennial problem, to which human reason is as far from an answer as ever." Sherlock Holmes in The Adventures of the Cardboard Box. Chapter 4. On Evil, Theodicy, and Philosophical Sundries. 4.1. The Problem of Evil and Suffering. Some have described the question of evil as the best proof against God. The problem of evil also has deep emotional and psychological ramifications for many people, and is a corollary of many other notions and premises. Pertinently, how does one define evil, and who is defining it? Evil is something relative and can only be defined by its creator. Otherwise, it becomes relative to the one beholding it. For example, the poison of a snake is good for the snake, but bad for other creatures. Is the poison good or bad? And who can actually define it as either one or the other? Therefore, is the mind alone sufficient in comprehending what is good and bad, or what is beautiful and ugly in actions, morals, and precepts? Before delving into these questions and much deeper philosophical inquiries, let us analyze the argument against God as presented in a logical syllogism, and then in a more popular emotional form. There are some clear fallacies in these arguments that will be highlighted and explained. Here is one form of the argument against God from the point of evil. Premise 1. If God exists, then God is omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect. If God is omnipotent, then God has the power to eliminate all evil. If God is omniscient, then God knows when evil exists. If God is morally perfect, then God has the desire to eliminate all evil. Premise 2. Evil exists. If evil exists and God exists, then either God does not have the power to eliminate all evil, or does not know when evil exists, or does not have the desire to eliminate all evil. Conclusion: therefore, God doesn't exist. A much more popular and provocative formulation of this argument was presented by the comedian Stephen Fry. By unraveling and invalidating the entire syllogism, and in particular dissecting the first premise, we will analyze how it renders the entire argument sterile. If God exists, then God is omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect. 4.2. What Stephen Fry said. Stephen Fry was being interviewed on Irish television by Gay Byrne and made now famous statements regarding God, which mainly revolves around the problem of evil. The following is a transcript of that interview. Interviewer: suppose it's all true and you walk up to the pearly gates and you are confronted by God. What would Stephen Fry say to him, her, or it? Stephen Fry: I will basically, it's known as Theodicy, I think. I'll say, bone cancer in children? What's that about? How dare you? How dare you create a world where there is such misery that is not our fault? It's not right. It is utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world that is so full of injustice and pain? That's what I would say. Interviewer: and you think you're going to get in? Stephen Fry: oh, but I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want to get in on his terms. They're wrong. Now, if I died and it was Pluto, Hades, and if it were the 12 Greek gods, then I'd have more truck with it. Because the Greeks didn't pretend not to be human in their appetites, and in their capriciousness and their unreasonableness. They didn't present themselves as being all-seeing, all-wise, all-kind, all-munificent, because the God who created this universe, if it was created by God, is, quite clearly, a maniac, utter maniac, totally selfish. We have to spend our life on our knees thanking him. What kind of God would do that? Yes, the world is very splendid, but it also has in it insects whose whole life cycle is to burrow into the eyes of children and make them blind. They eat outwards from the eyes. Why did you do that? Why? Why did you do that to us? You could easily have made a creation where that didn't exist. It is simply not acceptable. So, atheism is not just about not believing there's a God. But, on the assumption there is one, what kind of God is it? It's perfectly apparent that he is monstrous, utterly monstrous, and deserves no respect whatsoever. The moment you banish him, your life becomes simpler, purer, cleaner. More worth living, in my opinion. Interview. That sure is the longest answer to that question I've ever had in this entire series. Thank you so much, Stephen. Stephen Fry. Well, there wasn't a thunderbolt, was there? The fallacies contained in Stephen Fry's statement on God and evil turn largely on two premises. If you note in the interview, Stephen Fry points out his understanding of God's attributes and describes God as all-kind and all-munificent, truly names of God. But he omits other names of God, covered in the previous chapter, which linked to the discussion on the divine will of God and his manifestations through different names. If Stephen Fry had kept those names of God in mind, that part of his objections to God would not count for anything. He also asserted that if there were a God, he should not be obeyed, as his terms for getting into paradise are wrong, and ridiculing his so-called demand on us to stay on our knees throughout our lives. This first premise in the argument against God's syllogism cited above, from the point of view of evil, would be an acceptance of God's omnipotence and omniscience, even though generally atheists would not concede this point, denying the very existence of God. Even if an atheist did accept it for the sake of argument, it would only be acceptable in the case for evil being levied against God. Before breaking down the entire argument, it is essential to correctly understand each claim made. The first claim is the ascription of omnipotence to God. Omnipotence is a divine attribute that is established with God. An attribute of God would be something additional to the essence of God, and the attribute of omnipotence is an attribute by which God creates and instantiates possibilities ex nihilo. 4.3. The connections of the attributes of God. The connections of attributes with anything in the external realm can be categorized in three ways. 1. Connection by way of signification. 2. Connection by uncovering. And 3. Connection by effectuation. The first would be like the connection of speech to what it signifies. When a person speaks, their words will signify meanings in the external realm, concepts in the mind, or abstract thoughts. This connection of speech and to what it signifies is the first type of connection between an attribute and other things. The second type of connection which was mentioned is that of uncovering. For example, the connection between knowledge and that which is known, since knowledge uncovers that which is unknown, or the connection between sight and what is observable, as the sight uncovers those things which are observed. Similarly, the connection between hearing and the heard, with the faculty of hearing uncovering the sound of audible things, and indeed the comprehension of what can be comprehended, since comprehension uncovers the nature of whatever is uncovered. Knowledge, sight, hearing, and comprehension are all attributes which link to an uncovering of whatever they are connected to. The third type of connection refers to the attribute of will and that which is carried out by the will, or the attribute of power as well as the inverse connection when things are acted upon or affected by the attribute of power. As was mentioned in the chapter on epistemology, judgments of the mind that emanate solely from the mind, without recourse to habit or experimentation, are of three categories: those which are the necessary, the possible, and the impossible. Or we can say that which is necessarily true, the conceivable, and the inconceivable. Some object to this, saying that even judgments that occur in the mind have some recourse to observed external data. The response to this claim is that a person born blind, who may have not observed objects moving or being at rest, comprehends these concepts from the mind alone, and yet will comprehend concepts like colors and other things. Such a person can give judgments from the mind without recourse to external observation. Likewise, the one born blind and the one not born blind will know that an object cannot be still and moving at the same time, a category of rational judgment which belongs to the impossible. The divine power or omnipotence of God only relates to that which is rationally possible, and not to that which is necessary or impossible. The reason for it not connecting to the necessary is that if the absolutely necessary was subdued to the divine power, it could undergo change and therefore would not be necessary, as it is liable to change, entailing change to the very essence of the necessary, which would mean it was not necessary. Similarly, divine power not connected to the rationally impossible would render the rationally impossible no longer impossible, but able to undergo change, which would change the very nature of what it meant to be rationally impossible. The very meaning of something being rationally impossible is that it has no real existence, rather a confusion of concepts having no real combined existence, like the concept of a circular triangle. Therefore, it would be irrational to say, can God create a circular triangle? The fact that divine power is not connected to the necessary or the impossible does not entail any fault or defect in the divine power. On the contrary, it would be absurdity to associate divine power with necessities and impossibilities, nor does it entail inability or sterility. If someone were to say that a sword does not write like a pen, that is because the function of a sword is different to a pen. Yet the inability of the sword to write does not entail any fault or defect in the sword. 4.4. The Boulder Question. Can God create a boulder so huge that he cannot pick it up after making it? This is a common question by which, like many others, the atheist will think he has dumbfounded the theologian. This question is flawed because in effect the questioner is asking whether God can make himself powerless. This is where the contradiction lies. If God did create such a boulder, he would subsequently become powerless through being unable to pick up the boulder. The questioner is thinking that if God could not make such a boulder, that would mean he was powerless. To the questioner, it would mean that whichever answer was given, the answer would imply that God was powerless. However, once we realize that the divine power of God can only be associated with rational possibilities, not the impossible or necessary, then the defective nature of the question is revealed. For God to render himself powerless is impossible, and therefore there can never be a boulder that he cannot pick up. An additional point to note is that the divine power of God can only relate to that which he wills. If the divine will has not willed for something to come into existence, then the divine power will not bring it into existence. And this is the meaning of the statement, surely God is powerful over everything. Everything in this sense means everything that is rationally possible, and everything that he wills to occur. His divine will cannot connect to the instantiation of the impossible and the necessary, for reasons mentioned earlier. Such types of questions were not an uncommon occurrence in the past. An example may be given, that of when Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari was asked regarding the story of the Prophet Idris alayhi salam and Satan. 4.5. Satan's tricky question. It is said, even though it is not in any authenticated source, that Satan took the form of a man and approached the Prophet Idris alayhi salam while the latter was sewing some clothes. While sewing, the Prophet alayhi salam was proclaiming the glory of God and extolling his praise. Satan had with him an empty eggshell and used it to ask his tricky question. Can God place the world into this eggshell? The Prophet Idris alayhi salam responded by saying, God is powerful. He could place the entire universe into the hole of this needle. Then, to teach Satan a lesson, Idris alayhi salam poked Satan's eye with the needle. The anecdote is cited by some to say that the omnipotence of God is not restricted to what we term as the rationally possible, but also extends to the domains of what is deemed as rationally impossible. The immense universe, as it is, fitting into an eggshell is a rational impossibility. Yet the Prophet Idris alayhi salam said that it could be done. This conundrum in the form of this anecdote was posed to Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari and other Kalam specialists as a problem, since it ostensibly validates the impossible being done by God's divine power. The response given was simply that what the Prophet Idris alayhi salam had intended was that God could shrink the universe to make it fit into an eggshell, or make an egg huge enough to contain the universe, as both of these fall into the rubric of possibility. The Prophet Idris alayhi salam merely shortened his answer as the meaning was self-evident. And besides that, Satan has never been a sincere seeker of truth. 4.6. Divine Knowledge. The second part of the premise of the syllogism mentioned previously postulates that if God existed, then he is omniscient, all-knowing. This would mean that God has the attribute of divine knowledge. The question is, what does divine knowledge relate to from the point of view of rational possibilities? Firstly, it is pertinent to mention that the attribute of divine knowledge is not an affecting or executive attribute like omnipotence. What is meant is that it does not instantiate beings into and out of existence, being unrelated to such objectives, but rather is an attribute that uncovers what would otherwise be unknown. Uncover here does not entail that whatever is unveiled was veiled to God, and then became unveiled. Rather, it means that knowledge of all things has always been known to God, and his knowledge is not acquired or contingent. It would also mean that the knowledge of God does not entail compartmentalization or a thinking process like that of human knowledge. Instead, it is an eternal knowledge that has no beginning and no end, cannot be subtracted from or added to, and is an absolutely necessary attribute. If God did not have divine knowledge, then everything in the universe and creation beyond the universe would not exist, as someone who has deficient or incomplete knowledge would not be able to create the creation we observe, from the finely tuned universe and human brain to what we cannot observe with the naked eye, from quarks to whatever exists beyond them, as well as what is in the metaphysical realm. Knowledge of God relates to whatever is rationally possible, as well as what is impossible and necessary. The knowledge of God which relates to the necessary would be inclusive of knowledge of himself and his divine attributes, and thus, since his essence and attributes are eternal, his knowledge of them would also be eternal. 4.7. The necessary and the essential. Sometimes the term rationally necessary or rationally impossible can become confused with what is extrinsically necessary or impossible. An example of something extrinsically impossible would be a tree growing without roots. Would that mean God could not create a tree without roots? The answer clearly would be that God could create a tree without roots, as the fundamental need of trees for roots is but a creation of God who made it necessary. But this should not be confused with that which is essentially or intrinsically necessary or impossible, as the intrinsically necessary or impossible relates to that which can never be changed, and only the mind or rational judgment can determine that. If God knows everything that we do or will do, does this mean He compels us to carry out what we do, even though we think it is out of our own volition? The answer is no. God does not compel us to do what we can do using our own volition, despite the fact that God knows what we will do, and this is because the attribute of omniscience is an attribute that uncovers what would otherwise be unknown, and is not an attribute that is effective like the attribute of omnipotence, for instance. A lamp, to give an example, places light on objects that lie ahead, but does not affect those objects in the sense of breaking or fixing them. It just uncovers what lies ahead. Likewise, the knowledge that someone has may uncover that which is known to the one with knowledge, and unknown to others, but does not have effective power. 4.8. On Human Free Will. Human free will and its relationship to the omnipotence and omniscience of God, as well as punishment, hellfire, good and bad deeds, and other daunting subjects, are often misconstrued by atheists and religious bigots who think in absolutes or suffer from a splitting disorder of black and white thinking. Free will, in accordance to the Kalam methodology of Sunni rationalism, relates to our limited choice that we have in the acquisition or earning of deeds. The concept of mukhalif means a legally responsible person, and is synonymous with the one being addressed to by God in the Quran, and is subsequently held responsible for the specific choices he makes. A careful understanding of who exactly is a legally responsible person will expose the easy condemnations of people to hell made by ignorant and sometimes ostensibly religious people, and show them to be faulty, parochial, and in clear contradiction of the Quran and prophetic teachings. 4.9. The legally responsible. In Islam, there is a minimum of 10 conditions that must be fulfilled for anyone to be deemed legally responsible. If these conditions are fulfilled and yet the person is sinful and an unbeliever, the ultimate judgment will be by God, since we may judge an individual by the outward. Ultimately, judgment and salvation of specific individuals is known to God, not to bigots who think black and white, neither knowing the subtleties and the context, nor what the Quran and the prophetic tradition actually state. The first condition for anyone to be deemed as legally responsible, that is, being addressed to by the commands of the Quran and responsible to God, is that the person must have a sound intellect, as opposed to being mentally insane or mentally ill, nor having any such fault of the mind which renders the person unable to rationalize belief and what is being stated in the Quran or prophetic tradition. This, in effect, would mean that all people born with mental impairment, madness, or any inability of the mental faculties to comprehend what is being demanded by God will have salvation and not suffer any form of punishment. In Islamic law, Sharia, the mentally insane are exempt from punishments that are meted out to the sane for certain crimes. But this also relates to salvation in the hereafter. The question that arises here is what the opinion of Kalam theologians would be regarding a person who was initially sane, but who accrued misdeeds or became insane later. The response would involve taking into consideration the other 9 conditions to qualify a person to be legally responsible, and, supposing those requirements were met, the insane individual would be judged according to those misdeeds acquired during his time of sanity, given that he had not made amends prior to insanity. The absence of an intoxicated mind, whether through alcohol or narcotics, is another essential facet for a person to be deemed sane. A situation might occur where someone who has never heard of Islam or the Quran, while drunk, hears about the Quran, but on getting sober cannot recall a thing about it. If that person never hears anything more about Islam again in his life, then he will not face eternal punishment, as the message of Islam did not reach him while he was sober or thinking clearly. The second condition for an individual to be considered legally responsible is to have reached the age of maturity, which in Islamic law and theology is the age of puberty. Anyone who reaches puberty with sane mental faculties in Islamic law is deemed an adult. This means that children who die before maturity do not face perdition, and in fact stay in eternal bliss. So, what does it mean if we talk about a Christian child, or a Hindu child, or a Buddhist child? The response is very simple, in that as these children were born to parents who hold those respective beliefs, it does not in any way entail those children are to be condemned to the fate of their parents if they die upon their beliefs. A question that arises here is whether people born into a Muslim family have an unfair advantage in terms of guidance and salvation over children born into families of other faiths or no faiths. The answer is no, because individual salvation is dependent on a number of factors, and is not just an outward profession of Islam. The factors taken into consideration are the 10 conditions that we are currently discussing, along with the scope of free will and choice. A Muslim might outwardly profess Islam, but inwardly disbelieve. This person will not attain salvation according to Islamic doctrine, and is deemed a hypocrite, munafiq. In some instances, these may be religious fanatics who have no in-depth understanding of what beliefs actually are. They could be expressing an interpretation of Islam to distort it purposefully, or even suppressing their own doubts through a fanaticism rooted in ignorance. By the same token, someone born to non-Muslim parents and never hearing about Islam works in his favor, so much so that he is forgiven. The third condition for someone to be deemed legally responsible is that the correct message must reach them for them to be able to accept it as a correct doctrine. If a distorted form of Islam reaches them, they are only deemed legally responsible if they had access to correct information and interpretation. This condition answers the question regarding human societies who never heard of the true message in earlier times, or even today. Salvation in ancient times, prior to Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, was dependent on the acceptance of the message of previous prophets and messengers, like Moses ﷺ, and even then, their message was limited to their own nation. But if someone had never heard their message, or the message was not addressed to them, then such people would be exempt from any damnation. This would mean that some tribes in the Amazon, certain native groups or peasants during the Middle Ages, and countless other human groups will have salvation since the message of previous prophets or the message of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ did not reach them, or, if it did, reached them in a distorted way, for example, like a peasant in Europe during the Crusades. The Quran assures us that messengers were sent to all nations in ancient times, but as humans with limited knowledge, we do not know whether the message of those messengers reached every individual. For this reason, ultimate knowledge of individual salvation is left to God, since he does not act on assumption, but knows through his divine attribute of omniscience. In the modern age, however, there is more access to knowledge, even though the facts may be distorted. So every individual who hears of Islam, taking into account the other conditions, is legally responsible to learn the facts if they have access to correct information, or know a person willing to explain. An outright refusal to hear the truth despite being able to do so would render the person culpable. Consider the following scenario. John, your religion is violent because it has the concept of jihad, which is terrorism. Zaid, yes, it does have jihad. But to equate jihad with terrorism is wrong because what it actually is, John interrupting, I am sorry. I do not want to hear what you have to say, as it is old rubbish, and I do not want to hear it. Zaid, but let me give you a small book on the subject, or at least listen to a lecture on it. John, I have already made up my mind, and do not want to know. Let us suppose that John did listen and was given a correct exposition of what jihad actually is, and all his doubts were addressed. Yet he insisted on his presuppositions through disdain, bigotry, and arrogance. Then in such a case, John would be legally obligated to accept the responsibility. The fourth condition for someone to be deemed legally responsible would be of sound senses. If the loss of any sense impairs their understanding of what is being conveyed, they are not deemed liable for not adopting the true message. This would include, for instance, someone born deaf and blind, or the deaf who speak in sign language, but who cannot really understand the deep import and nuances of those words. This condition will of course vary in accordance with the type of sense disability. The fifth condition for a person to be deemed legally responsible is the ability to investigate the truth. If this does not exist due to a lack of comprehension and mental inability to do so, or physical constraints, like being a prisoner, for example, then the person will not be legally responsible other than according to his ability. The sixth condition is that a person is not in a coercive situation which threatens life or limb. This particular condition is more peculiar to acts which otherwise would be deemed sinful. An example of this would be eating pork to stay alive where no other food is available, or having a swig of alcohol to wash down a morsel that is choking a person to death, it being the nearest available drink. In such scenarios, a person would not be deemed legally responsible. The seventh condition for someone to be deemed legally responsible is the absence of negligence. Negligence here entails being busy to the point that the mind pays no attention to the obligation, as opposed to a willful abandonment of the obligation. The eighth condition is absence through deep sleep. Once the person awakes, he shall be deemed legally responsible. The ninth condition is absence through forgetfulness. Once the memory returns, he shall be deemed legally responsible. The 10th condition is the absence of coercion, as being forced to do something against free will is not deemed a sin. The Quran states, there is no compulsion in religion. Quran 2:256. This verse of the Quran actually means that if someone adopts a faith through compulsion, they will not actually believe from the heart and will, therefore, not attain salvation by compulsion. Subsequently, forced conversions are prohibited in Islam, with jihad never decreed specifically to spread Islam, but rather to protect territories under Muslim governance. After these 10 conditions are met, that person is deemed legally responsible under Islamic law and theology, and considered sinful if they contravene the commands of God. This would mean that free will to a limited scope is subject to scrutiny of God's law, and does not cover every aspect of human life. This accounts for what God says in the Quran, God does not burden a soul more than it can bear. Quran 2:286. 4.10. Unbelievers. If someone does not believe in Islam and yet his judgment is left ultimately to God, why do Muslims refer to such unbelievers as Kāfir? Why does the Quran condemn unbelievers to hell? The term Kāfir means to cover, as in the night covering everything in darkness, or the farmer covering the seeds he plants with soil. The term Kāfir also means to reject, as in rejecting Islam, and in such a way Muslims are Kāfir from what the unbelievers say, since Muslims reject their beliefs. The Kāfir also covers the truth. The Kāfir mentioned in the Quran is the person who fulfills all the 10 conditions for being legally obligated, and yet after fulfilling those conditions, rejects the truth, and thus is condemned for doing so. However, there are groups or individuals who may not fulfill all the conditions, but are still referred to as Kāfir in the legal sense, although this does not occasion individual damnation. A simplification of this would be that of a Muslim traveling through the Amazon and coming across a tribe that he cannot communicate with. This tribe has never met people from modern cities, and will unlikely fulfill the 10 conditions of being legally obligated, yet still the term Kāfir is applied to them as they are not Muslims, with the ultimate judgment of this tribe left to God, who does not punish people whom the message has not reached. The Muslim will deal with this tribe, in terms of worldly transactions and dealings, as Kāfir people, as he cannot eat their slaughtered meat, marry into them, plus a few other communal interactions. However, their ultimate salvation is left to God, and if one of them dies, a Muslim cannot pray the funeral over them or make a supplication for them. Some jurists counsel that the term Kāfir should be avoided when offending non-believers. These are all legal rulings and ramifications, but the ultimate judgment is with God. In the Quran, there are groups of unbelievers that have been warned regarding eternal punishment. Those are unbelievers who nevertheless fulfill the 10 conditions mentioned above. 4.11. The outward Muslim and the outward Kāfir. Zayd is born in a Muslim family to Muslim parents. He grows up as a nominal Muslim and follows his religion, but with blind conformity and no real conviction. One day, Zayd comes across some atheist arguments at school and becomes convinced that Islam is untrue and that there is no God. Not wanting to upset his family, Zayd decides to conceal his atheism. During the month of Ramadan, he fasts when at home, but when with his friends he will indulge in a haram meal, even alcohol and drugs and other vices prohibited in Islam. His family remains unaware of his inward state of atheism and continues to treat him as a Muslim. He may even marry a Muslim woman who thinks Zayd is a Muslim and have children and grandchildren. When Zayd dies, the Imam of the mosque performs his funeral prayer, and people supplicate for him thinking he has died a true Muslim. Yet, with God, he is a Kāfir in the true sense of the word. Tom, on the other hand, is born in a non-Muslim family. Tom grows up skeptical about God. Tom spends all his life as a non-Muslim, until one day he researches Islam because of a terrorist attack which has raised his interest in this religion he has little knowledge of. During his research, he is convinced of the truthfulness of Islam and believes in it from his heart. However, Tom has never met a Muslim and never comes across one, and he never expresses his beliefs to anyone as the need never arises. Then Tom dies. No imam prays his funeral, and no supplications are made for him. Any Muslim hearing of Tom's death or reading his obituary would think that a Kāfir had died and would not be permitted by Islamic law to supplicate or pray for someone Kāfir. Yet, Tom was not a Kāfir, but a true Muslim and a believer, and will have salvation. Free will in a person is what exists within every human being and experienced by every human being on a daily basis. While you read this book, you exercise your free will. Yet to what extent do external factors like society, social pressures, and others determine free will? The response would be that these factors can inspire human free will, but do not take away human choice. A person born to a mother who smokes crack cocaine and is then raised within an abusive environment and society will be affected in many ways by his surroundings. However, those social pressures do not remove the free will of that person, even if he is influenced by many negative factors. If you study the 10 parameters of a legally responsible individual and apply them on a person with such a social background of psychological and spiritual suffering, it will become apparent that God has not tasked him with more than he can bear, as all the factors that affect a person in their life are taken into account by God. This is in reference to the religious obligations and judgment in the hereafter, not in reference to personal suffering and psychological issues on earth. It must also be taken into account that such a person is not punished for actions influenced by their environment, to the degree that it affects their free will. Additionally, the person is rewarded for any suffering in the hereafter. This remaining human free will, which remains despite society and other pressures, is what is responsible for belief and disbelief, good deeds and bad deeds. If the free will of a person is taken away totally, either through abuse or thought reform, and psychological totalism, then such a person is not liable on the day of judgment to the same degree as a person who has their free will and choice functioning. This, of course, varies according to the level of spiritual and psychological abuse, which may paralyze the freedom of the will, which can be determined by God alone. This is precisely what is meant by God not tasking a soul more than what it can bear. 4.12. Divine Will and Human Free Will. A person can never determine where they are born, where they die, nor how tall they will be. Even so, many things have been placed under the minimal authority of the human free will. This minimal choice we have in various matters of human responsibility is what is being addressed in the Quran by God. Wherever a person has no choice, he is not liable to punishment or retribution from God. It is only within the realm of freedom of choice, the free will, that the human being is being asked to acquire good deeds and or avoid bad deeds. God's knowing what we do, earn, or acquire with our free will does not entail that he has coerced us into those actions when we exercise our free will. The divine knowledge of how things will be is referred to as qada in the Kalam theology, and the creation of such things is referred to as qadar. God knows that Tom will eat 5,000 loaves of bread throughout his life, and decreed it by creating Tom and the 5,000 specific loaves for Tom to eat through the various periods of his life. But does this decree and foreordained knowledge of God negate Tom's free will to earn and acquire good and bad deeds? The answer is no. In the same way that God has created Tom and the world around him, God has created within Tom a free will which is the choice of acquisition. This choice of acquisition of good or bad within a very limited period of life and a limited number of choices is what Tom is responsible for. This is the meaning of the Quranic verse, "Indeed, we offered the trust to the heavens and the earth and the mountains, but they all declined to bear it, being fearful of it. but humanity assumed it, for they are truly wrongful to themselves and ignorant of the consequences. Quran 33:72. The trust referred to in the Quran concerns the intellect and free will, both of which are prerequisite to a true faith, since there is no faith without intellectual pursuit and the use of human free will. Clearly, there is a determinism in many factors, such as where a person is born, and into what family and in which country. But ultimately his human responsibility lies in his own limited intellect and free will which he has, and for as long as he has, as a trust from God which he must uphold. A human being's freedom lies in his choice to do good or bad. When he carries out his choice, it is God who has created his ability of doing so, and the means by which that action is carried out. In summary, those things which are out of our control are referred to as the will of God because He creates them. This includes other humans exercising their free will and their actions. Our own personal actions are referred to as the will of God because He has willed for us to have a free will. Before Arthur Schopenhauer wrote, Der Mensch kann zwar tun, was will, aber kann nicht wollen, was will, which translates from the German as, Man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. The Quran had already declared, But you will not, unless God wills. Surely God is ever all-knowing, all-wise. Quran 76:30. The negation of will from man is the negation of independent creating, while the affirmation of the will of God for man is the free will, relatively limited as it is, that creates within man that by which he undertakes his responsibility and on which, alongside the intellect, he will be questioned in the afterlife. It may be said that the will is an inbuilt ability like the ability to speak, which the person utilizes in the same way he uses his ability to speak. The will could also be described through the connection between the whole of the created will with the specific option of doing or abandoning something that emanates from the person by choice. Although the will as a whole is created by God, the specific individual option of doing or abandoning something is not. Rather, it is a mode, not an external existent, but something that is subjective, such as when we describe an action as obedient or disobedient, indeed similar to those states or modes of things that are between existence and non-existence, an intermediate mode of existence between being and non-being. Does the ability of the individual to make a resolve and acquire good or bad deeds undermine the power of God? Does it mean that the human is creating his own actions? We would respond by saying that God creates everything, while the human being earns or acquires. This allows a person to turn their free will and use the limited powers created by God towards carrying out actions in acquisition, yet at the same time acknowledging that the action brought about thereafter is the creation of God. That power and free will placed within us is also a creation of God. As such, its reality is that it is an accidental that God has bestowed on the human, through which we make our choices, and yet it is the underlying cause, or, one could say, it is the condition for the carrying out of any action. Schopenhauer's description of the will as a noumenal property was definitely referring to a pre-Kantian definition, as Schopenhauer had criticized Kant's use of the word noumenal. What Schopenhauer meant by noumenal was reality itself, independent of our sense perceptions, a single, undifferentiated entity that we can learn about. He called this entity the will. Much earlier than Schopenhauer, El-Kirmani stated, The servant has a choice in his actions, but has no choice in his choice. Lastly, the ability of the will is an attribute that God creates at the time when a person makes a resolve to carry out an action, once the means and instruments of that intended action are available and sound. If the person intends to carry out good, God will create the ability to do good, while if the person intends to do bad, God will create the ability to do bad. By making the wrong choice, the human being is thus responsible for any evil actions he may carry out, thereby wasting the free will God has given him. It is important to note at this point that the endowment of free will is from God, yet what that person does with that free will is his own doing. If he chooses to do wrong, the pleasure of God is not in that choice. Therefore, there is a distinction between the will of God and his pleasure over the action taken by his servants. Philosophers have been debating these issues from Hellenistic times, predating the Stoics, leaving some philosophers to lament the lack of progression made. This conundrum is known as the problem of free will, and there are as many positions on it as there are philosophical schools. Western philosophers would likely describe the Kalam position as compatibilism or soft determinism. 4.13. The meaning of God willing. The statement, God willing, is not a negation of the free will of a human being as commonly thought. The will of God is a reference to the creation of the means by which things are carried out, and does not negate the free will of humans. It reflects the recognition by the one who utters it that God creates the means by which all actions are carried out, once the human resolve to carry out a particular action has been made. If Tom resolves to drive to Cornwall and said, God willing, I am going to drive to Cornwall, the will of God means that God creates for Tom's the instruments by which he can reach Cornwall, starting from his means of transport and its working parts, the roads that lead to Cornwall, as well as his safety. The will of God does not negate the free will of Tom to make that choice of wanting to travel to Cornwall. 4.14. The meaning of God guides whom he wills and misguides whom he wills. There are a few verses in the Quran that are often quoted to give the impression that human choice is rendered impossible because they say that God guides or misguides whomever he wills, leaving apparently the human no choice. For instance, it is stated in the Quran, surely you do not guide whomever you love, but Allah guides whomever he decides, and he knows best the ones who are rightly guided. Quran 28:56. The meaning of this, of course, is that once a person makes a choice of accepting guidance, then God increases him in guidance, and if the person makes the choice of misguidance, then God increases him in misguidance. Therefore, the will of God in guiding or misguiding someone is to augment the human who chooses guidance in his guidance, and to increase the misguidance of anyone who chooses misguidance, while the initial choice remained that of the person, albeit presuming that the conditions of a legally responsible person had been fulfilled. This does not amount to a negation of the free human choice to believe or to disbelieve, but rather that the will of God is to guide or misguide whom he wills, and that will is in accordance with the choice of the individual. This is exemplified by the verse of the Quran which says, I will turn away from my signs those who are arrogant upon the earth without right. And if they should see every sign, they will not believe in it. And if they see the way of consciousness, they will not adopt it as a way. But if they see the way of error, they will adopt it as a way. That is because they have denied our signs, and they were heedless of them. Quran 7:146. a person chooses not to listen or understand the truth, and purposefully chooses misguidance, then such a person, due to his choice, is further misguided, and the means of misguidance are compounded by his choice and arrogance. 4.15 Prophetic Reports on Free Will. As with Quranic sources, certain prophetic reports are commonly thought to negate human free will, and these will be examined below. First report. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu reported that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who is the most truthful and his being truthful is a fact, said, "Verily, your creation is in the following manner. The constituents of one of you are collected for 40 days in his mother's womb in the form of blood, after which it becomes a clot of blood in another period of 40 days. Then it becomes a lump of flesh, and 40 days later Allah sends his angel to it with instructions concerning 4 things. So the angel writes down his livelihood, his death, his deeds, his fortune and misfortune. By him, besides whom there is no God, that one amongst you acts like the people deserving paradise, until between him and paradise there remains but the distance of a cubit, when suddenly the writing of destiny overcomes him, and he begins to act like the denizens of hell, and thus enters hell, while another one acts in the way of the denizens of hell, until there remains between him and hell a distance of a cubit, that the destiny overcomes him, and then he begins to act like the people of paradise, and enters paradise." The wording that gives the outward meaning of the removal of free will is, that one amongst you acts like the people deserving paradise, until between him and paradise there remains but the distance of a cubit, when suddenly the writing of destiny overcomes him, and he begins to act like the denizens of hell, and thus enters hell. The ostensible meaning of this report is that a person does the actions of the people of paradise, but because the writing of destiny overwhelms him, he ends up doing the actions of the people of hell and subsequently enters hell. This would mean that people have no free will and are compelled by God to do actions which fulfill a destiny in which they have no choice. This would be correct if a person went according to this wording of the narration, but if you add the wording of an additional variant of the narration in Sahih Muslim, you also find the wording, "in that which is apparent." This would render the narration to read, that one amongst you acts like the people deserving paradise in that which is apparent, until between him and paradise there remains but the distance of a cubit, when suddenly the writing of destiny overcomes him, and he begins to act like the denizens of hell and thus enters hell. So, what is the exact meaning of the narration? The report alludes to the outwardly pious person who outwardly does actions that have the appearance of the actions of the people of paradise, but inwardly this person is corrupt, arrogant, and a hypocrite. Therefore, toward the end of his life, God removes his facade and the person will end up revealing his hypocrisy. On the other side of the spectrum is the man who is a sinner and outwardly disobedient to God, yet inwardly he believes in God and he has no arrogance, his sins only a result of weakness or desires. Such a person will be given the enablement of obeying God toward the end of his life, and God will reveal his inner goodness despite his outward shortcomings. Second report. Ali radiyallahu anhu reported, "We were in a funeral in the graveyard of Gharqad, when the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam came to us and we sat around him. He had a stick with him. He lowered his head and began to scratch the earth with his stick, and then said, 'There is not one amongst you whom a seat in paradise or hell has not been allotted, and about whom it has not been written down whether he would be an evil person or a blessed person.' A person said, 'O Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, should we not then depend upon our destiny and abandon our deeds?' Thereupon he, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, said, "Acts of everyone will be facilitated in that which has been created for him, so that whoever belongs to the company of the blessed will have good works made easier for him, and whoever belongs to the unfortunate ones will have evil acts made easier for him." He then recited this verse from the Quran: "Then, who gives to the needy and guards against evil and accepts the excellent, we shall make easy for him the easy end. And who is miserly and considers himself above need, we shall make easy for him the difficult end." Quran 92, 5-10. The seats that have already been designated for people in hell or paradise are in accordance with the divine knowledge of God as to what actions people will do. In another report, it is stated that seats have been created for every human in both hell and paradise. And depending on the choice of the person to acknowledge his servitude to God, the person will enter either hell or paradise by the choices he made on earth, after the fulfillment of the prerequisites of a legally responsible person. The meaning of the phrase, "acts of everyone will be facilitated in that which has been created for him, so that whoever belongs to the company of the blessed will have good works made easier for him, and whoever belongs to the unfortunate ones will have evil acts made easier for him," is that God knows which people will choose to do good and recognize their servitude to God, and those who will not do good and not recognize their servitude. And subsequently the choices that people make are made easier for them. With the person who chooses the way of misguidance, his way to evil is facilitated because of his evil motives and indecent exercise of free will. 4.16 Sin and Free Will. Once a person is deemed legally responsible for actions and recognizes his servitude to God, he is liable to reward and punishment for obedience or disobedience respectively, while a person who is legally responsible and who does not acknowledge his servitude to God is deemed an unbeliever and faces eternal damnation. These are problematic for atheism on various counts. If, however, we keep in mind the conditions by which someone is deemed legally responsible, it becomes clear that a specific segment of society is being addressed, with the onus of acknowledging their servitude to their Creator on them, and secondly, the avoidance of what He has prohibited, and compliance with what He has commanded. A point-blank refusal to believe in God renders a person an unbeliever, while a falling short of God's commands makes one a sinner. Both of these are problematic, as is claimed by the atheist, in that these concepts lead to a mental and spiritual slavery, causing anxiety and other psychological issues. The question would be whether acknowledging such servitude and following God's divine commands really leads to anxiety, or whether, by contrast, it is ignorance of what Islam actually teaches that leads to it. The correct answer would be the latter, that ignorance leads to that. The sins of a person only relate to that which falls under the free will, and not that which is caused by duress. Actions which are carried out through duress are forgiven, like disbelief due to a forced conversion, when the Quran clearly says, "Whoever disbelieves in Allah after his belief, except for one who is forced while his heart is secure in faith. But those who open their breasts to unbelief, upon them is wrath from Allah, and for them is a great punishment." Quran 16:106. Again, as in the case of someone facing hunger pangs with no availability of food, other than eating pig meat or other prohibited things to stay alive, the Quran says, "Surely He has prohibited for you only carrion, i.e. dead meat, and blood and the flesh of swine, and whatever has been acclaimed to other than Allah. So, whoever is constrained, neither being inequitable nor aggressive, then no sin will be upon them. Surely Allah is ever forgiving, ever merciful. Quran 2:173. Further reasons for a sinner not to despair lie in God's forgiveness of all sins as long as the person repents before dying and makes amends. Even in the worst scenario, if a sinner dies without repenting, there are many sinners who go unpunished, the sole exception being for unbelief, because unbelief is built on arrogance. While the believing sinner acknowledges his servitude to his Creator and does not reject his innate neediness to the divine Creator. This is why the Quran says, "Say, O my servants who have transgressed against themselves by sinning, do not despair of the mercy of Allah. Indeed, Allah forgives all sins. Verily, it is He who is the forgiving, the merciful." Quran 38:53. But even if a sinner does not repent from certain sins, God still forgives him or removes the sins on the account of the good deeds that a person does. God says in the Quran, "Whoever comes with a good deed will be rewarded tenfold, but whoever comes with a bad deed will be punished for only one. None will be wronged." Quran 6:160. In one hadith, it is stated that if a person sins, the angels wait 6 worldly hours before recording it in order to give the sinner time to repent. Even if he does not repent, the Quran tells us that good deeds erase bad deeds, and one bad action is counted as 1, while a good action is counted as 10. This would mean that if a bad deed is erased by a good deed, there is still the remainder of 9 good counts, one portion only having erased the bad deed. It is stated too in the Quran that if a person repents in worldly life and makes amends, his bad actions are changed into good. As for those who repent, believe, and do good deeds, they are the ones whose evil deeds Allah will change into good deeds. For Allah is all forgiving, most merciful. Quran 25:70. The severity of punishment for some sins is due to the harm they cause to others, or infringing the rights of humans and animals. And whatever strikes you of disaster, it is for what your hands have earned, but He pardons much. Quran 42:30. Should one person be a sinner and another outwardly pious, God will know the inner reality and their motives, as well as the soundness of heart. The following stories told by the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ illustrates this reality. The story of the prostitute and the dog. Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu reported, the Prophet ﷺ said, "A prostitute had once been forgiven. She passed by a dog panting near a well. Thirst had nearly killed him, so she took off her sock, tied it to her veil, and drew up some water. Allah forgave her for that." The story of the woman and the cat. The Prophet ﷺ also gave the parable of a woman and a cat. The Prophet ﷺ said, "A woman entered the hellfire because of a cat which she had tied up, giving it neither food nor setting it free to eat from the creatures of the earth." The story of the Sufi sage and the Mongol chief. It is related that when the Mongols sacked Baghdad, they interrogated many of its influential citizens. One of the people they interrogated was a Sufi sage. The Mongol chief attempted to deride him, saying, "The hair of your beard is equal to the fur of my dog." The sage paused before responding, "You are correct. If I do not obey my master the way your dog obeys you, then the hair of my beard is worthless, and of less value than the fur on your dog." The Mongol chief, dumbstruck by the response, released the man. 4.17. The danger of religious arrogance. It happens that a person who performs an outward action of piety begins to think himself superior to others whom he deems sinners. Such a person has not fulfilled the duty of servitude to God, even though he may think he has, eventually falling victim to this inner sin of arrogance. Conversely, a sinner may attain a high rank with God because he deems himself low and is ashamed of his sins. Such a person is beloved by God, who will eventually enable him to turn back to him, offering him different means of support. This is why the Sufi aphorisms mention, "A sin that leads to humility is better than a virtue that leads to arrogance and hubris." No one can say with certainty that an atheist alive today is surely going to hell, since through an innate sincerity he may be led to the straight path before he dies, recognizing his servitude to God. On the other hand, an individual who outwardly believes, yet is inwardly arrogant, believing in himself and not God, leading to a narcissism noticeable, for example, in cult leaders. These, at the time of death, mistakenly believe in themselves and their self-servitude. It is this kind of pseudo-religiosity that people often mistake for theism, and typically involve group dynamics whereby the followers, at the behest of the leader, attribute divine-like properties to the leader. 4.18. Why does God need our worship? Some atheists have framed this same objection differently by saying that God is a cosmic dictator or a heavenly Saddam Hussein. This is based on the conception that God must deal with people, like the leader of a country should serve the people who elected him. If he does not, then he is a dictator and has ill-served the people he governs. The analogy of God's justice to the leader of a nation or commonwealth is hopelessly flawed. How can one compare a human leader with the one who created humanity and established the heavens and the earth? The injustice witnessed in the world relates to the unjust people who violate the rights of others. Unjust because, for example, the people, their property and their rights, dignity and honor do not belong to a dictator. This is not the case with God, since everything belongs to him, and he does as he wills. The fact that God can do what he wants is why some atheists despise the very concept of God, and liken him to a cosmic dictator, falling into the evident blunder of comparing a human dictator with the creator of everything, who does what he wants with his creation. Let us suppose God chose not to punish anyone, but rather place us in eternal bliss only after taking away our free will and rationality. Or let us suppose God decided to punish everyone without reason. In either of these imagined scenarios, how would that disprove God, and how could anyone object to God's logic if they themselves had any access to logic in those scenarios? Such an objection would be impossible, as the very meaning of human justice would be absent, since what we take as justice or injustice in this world is shown in the imperfections, difficulties, and suffering which God has created for us, and not least in the gift of intellect and free will. Justice means giving everyone their due right, while injustice, on the other hand, is taking away that right, something we only learn about through our interaction with fellow human beings and with other sentient creatures. Preserving and ensuring that those rights are not violated is what we learn from this realm. This can never be applicable to God, as God created both humans and their free will, and he is the one who obligated us to uphold the rights of one another. Thus, for created beings to demand that God treat him like a benevolent ruler is a fallacy, as God does what he wants. God has tasked his servants on earth with only that which they can bear, not overburdening them with what they cannot do, judging them on their actions of choice from their intellect and free will, as well as all the other conditions of a legally responsible person. God guides anyone who is sincere in the heart and wants guidance, and he misguides the one who is arrogant and rebellious. Justice, when ascribed to God, is whatever he wills to do, and not what humans or anyone else thinks he should do, as the values of justice as we understand them are the human standards of how we deal with one another. Yet God transcends these conventions. God, by definition, could, if he wanted, place all his worshippers in hell and all those who disobey him in paradise, and he could punish with or without account. However, he will not do this nor be unjust in the least, as he is not judged himself and cannot be measured by human standards. Accepting this fact is the essence of faith and the meaning of servitude to God. This is why Islam means submission and submitting to the divine will of God, while the refusal to acknowledge this reality is termed Kāfir, which is concealing the reality of our innate neediness of the divine and our need to submit to him. The refusal to accept God's lordship and supreme sovereignty is rooted in the mistake of equating God, his actions and attributes, with human nature, deeming him to be like a president or a worldly king dealing with their subjects. This is the inherent flaw of unbelief. A believer acknowledges his inherent neediness to his Creator and recognizes that the Creator, in whatever he does, is just and right and is not judged by our standards. Yet, God only punishes those who have full cognizance of what they are doing, have sound intellect, have reached maturity, and know that those actions are disapproved. Even after that, many sins, and sometimes all sins, are forgiven, with the sole exception of unbelief. This reality of servitude and the innate need we have of God reveals itself at our weakest points. This is why humans tend to exclaim, "Oh God," during turbulence on an airplane, or when waves thump the side of a boat at sea and other similar situations. God does not need our worship. He created us, thereby giving us the greatest of gifts, our own existence and life. A man indeed could spend his entire life without knowing about God or hearing his message, and still enter eternal bliss in the afterlife, simply because God does not punish a person who has not heard the divine message. Yet those who have been gifted intellect, rational thought, ability, and the time to investigate the message that reaches them, maturity, cognizance, and the right societal factors like not having their free will undermined by mental abuse and totalitarianism, such are those expected to submit and acknowledge their innate servitude to God. This is the meaning of what God says in the Quran, "I created the jinn and humankind only that they might worship me." Quran 51:56. Some have translated the word worship as service, giving the impression to some that the meaning of this is hard acts of worship, rituals, and rites. The correct meaning, however, is that man has been created to know God. This is why Ibn Abbas, radiallahu anh, the cousin of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, said that worship means to know him. Knowing God means to recognize him with the mind and heart by observing his signs. Attaining the means of recognizing him is through worship, because worship is a constant means of recognizing God. That is referred to in the verse. Is worship merely a collection of rituals and rites which nonconformists dread? Or does it consist of other things? It should be clearer at this point that worship consists of thinking and science, and not just the rites of worship. God states in the Quran, "Indeed, in the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the alternation of the day and night, there are signs for people of reason. They are those who remember Allah while standing, sitting, and lying on their sides, and reflect on the creation of the heavens and the earth and pray, 'Our Lord, you have not created all of this without purpose. Glory be to you. Protect us from the torment of the fire. Our Lord, indeed those you commit to the fire will be completely disgraced, and the wrongdoers will have no helpers.'" Quran 3, 190 to 192. Remembering itself is an act of worship. The Prophet ﷺ said, "The best of God's servants are those who observe the sun, crescent moons, and the stars as a way of remembering God." In summary, after having been created and given the gifts of life, intellect, and free will, the only thing demanded of the human being is to recognize and know his divine creator. Those for whom this message reaches are thereby informed as to how to expand their intellectual and spiritual knowing of that creator. Those who do not receive the message or who do not meet the conditions of being legally responsible are exempt from this obligation, even though some of them may know God solely through their intellects, without recourse to divine revelation. God says, "And whoever strives only strives for himself. Indeed, God is free from need of the worlds." Quran 29:6. 4.19. The purpose of human life. Why did God create us at all if he knew that some of us would go to hell? Does this not contradict his being the most merciful and utterly good, as the premise of the above syllogism suggests, that he is morally perfect? The answer to this question, given the previous elaboration, would simply be that God is the doer of what he wills. This objection, however, has an additional caveat in that God, in creating people, knows many will disobey him, and this would seem to contradict the attribute of being the most merciful. Why would the divine action of God create beings who will ultimately disobey him through their own free will, including the likes of Satan? Would not this be the same as someone saying they have fidelity to their spouse, and then commit adultery while still claiming fidelity? The mistake this objector makes is not realizing that the manifestation of the names of God in Islam relates to the attribute of divine will. When God wills, he gives life, and when he wills, he takes life, and when he wills, he gives sustenance, and when he wills, he withholds the sustenance, all in accordance with his divine will and divine knowledge and wisdom. God has the names the withholder, Al-Qabid, and the sustainer, Ar-Razaq, names manifested in accordance with his divine will without contradiction, unlike fidelity and adultery, which are not manifestations of two different actions that are mutually exclusive, but the manifestation of two contradictory meanings. A man who is married cannot have fidelity while being an adulterer, as fidelity implies the absence of adultery. Yet a person can be generous to whomever he wants, and stingy with whomever he wants, and there will be no contradiction between the two here. For God to manifest his most merciful nature to a specific creation is his will, and for him to manifest his name as the punisher, the one who harms, to any one of his creation, is also his divine will. For a human to judge God on human standards reflects a deep flaw in thinking, as it is totally incommensurable to compare the all-knowing with those who have partial, contingent, and limited knowledge, especially given that the one has no need of his creation, while creatures need him and require one another for various motives. Who and what is good and utterly good is not determined by the human when it relates to the divine, and the same applies to moral perfection, as human standards of morality and goodness vary amongst themselves, and change from society to society and over time. The goodness and badness of anything is not determined by the human mind alone, as will be discussed below. Only those who disbelieve after misusing their free will and intellect will God punish. Having been given these gifts, along with the mental capability to investigate the revealed Scripture, and having access to those who may remove any intellectual obscurity. By saying God has wronged these people, by giving them free will and intellect after having given them life, supremely precious itself, also contradicts human logic. If a father leaves his sons an inheritance of millions divided equally between two sons, yet knowing that one son will spend wisely and the other son will waste the money, has the father wronged the sons by bequeathing them their inheritance? By God gifting someone with life, intellect, and free will, he has conferred a greater favor on that being than anything else. With all that God commands, being that that person recognizes and acknowledges his servitude to the divine, which will also be rewarded on earth and in the afterlife. The rewards on earth come in many forms, like the favors God confers upon us, one favor of God outweighing all of our good deeds. 4.20. The man who worshipped for 500 years. The angel Gabriel alayhi salam related the following incident to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam about a man in the past who worshipped God continuously for 500 years. He was granted shelter on top of a mountain surrounded by salty water. God, however, caused a stream of sweet water to flow through the mountain to that individual. The man would drink from this water and use it to make ritual ablution, wudu'. God also raised a pomegranate tree, from which the man would eat one fruit every day. One day, this man prayed to God, "O God, bring my death while I am in the state of prostration." God accepted his supplication. Whenever Gabriel alayhi salam came down to the earth, he found the man prostrating in worship. Gabriel alayhi salam said, "On the day of judgment, God will tell the angels to take this individual to paradise through his mercy. However, this man will insist that he should enter paradise through the good deeds that he has performed." Then Gabriel alayhi salam said, "God will tell the angels to compare the man's good deeds with the blessings that were given to him in the world. It will be shown to him that 500 years of his worship does not even equal the gift of sight from God. The angels will proceed to lead him towards hell, at which point the man will plead, "O God, let me enter paradise by your mercy only." At that point, the following discussion will take place between God and that man. God will ask, "O my servant, who created you?" The worshipper will reply, "O God, you have created me." God will say, "Were you created because of the good deeds you have done, or because of my mercy?" The worshipper will respond, "Because of your mercy." God will inquire, "Who granted you the ability to worship for 500 years?" The worshipper will affirm, "O Almighty, you have granted me that ability." God will say, "Who placed you on the mountain surrounded by the ocean? Who caused a stream of sweet water to flow in between the salty water? Who caused a pomegranate tree to grow for you? Who granted you death while in prostration?" The worshipper with humility and shame will state, "O Sustainer of the worlds, you have done all of these." Then God will say, "All these things happened through my mercy, and you too will enter paradise only through my mercy." The favor of life, free will, and the intellect, is greater than non-existence. The one who has been given these favors is in a state of safety, with full cognizance and senses, maturity, imbued with the correct message, under no duress and with the ability to investigate, along with all the other conditions of legal responsibility. Then, and only then, is such a person liable to punishment for not accepting his own innate servitude and the divine favors conferred upon him. Any refusal to acknowledge God after all of these favors indicates an underlying arrogance, and that is why a person is punished. If life, free will, and intellect were not so precious, then people would not deem human life so worthy as to require punishment for murder, and most would accept the morality of euthanasia or the abortion of a living fetus. Some atheists, while they may not accept other forms of murder, already deem euthanasia and abortion morally acceptable. 4.21. A thought experiment. This is an experiment in thinking for the one who makes the previous objection. You are transported back in time via a time machine to Austria. The date is 20th of April, and the year is 1889. You are taken to baby Hitler, who has just been born, and you are given the option of killing him to prevent all the dreadful evil he will commit in the future. You have full knowledge that this life will be the cause of World War II and the Holocaust, and innumerable other crimes against humanity. You are presented with the choice of ending his life and preventing the subsequent free will and intellect Hitler will develop in his adult life, by which he will carry out his war crimes. What do? Do you allow him to live and carry out his choices in the full knowledge of what he will do? Or do you kill him, depriving this one child of life, and saving others from his evil in the foreseen future? If you choose the option to take his life, then you could never object when God takes away life, destroys, punishes, causes pestilence and disease, blindness, allows humans to carry out their crimes, and innumerable other things. If you would kill the baby Hitler solely on the strength of your limited human knowledge, then it should be only too easy to imagine what God does and wills, due to his divine wisdom and eternal knowledge. The second option, that of allowing baby Hitler to live, for the fact that he has not actually done anything at that given moment and is entitled to life, free will, and intellect, and despite knowing what he will do with his free will, there is no way you could object to God creating humans with life, free will, intellect, and many other favors, knowing that they will misuse those favors and end up in hell by choice. God says, "Be grateful to God, and whoever is grateful for himself, and whoever denies his favor, then indeed Allah is free of need and praiseworthy." Quran 31:12. 4.22. Why does God burn the unbelievers in hell for eternity? This question intends to probe the logicality of eternal punishment. The three main contestants in this difficult scenario are hell, evil, which includes suffering, and divine law, which in the case of Islam is Sharia. The objection to be answered is why unbelievers should be punished for eternity and not momentarily, if they should be punished at all. As already discussed, God could place all of humanity in hell, which would not make him unjust, a sufficient answer from our point of view. But let us take this promise of punishment in its true context, and alleviate any anxiety for the probing mind. All crimes are punishable by government laws, and judgments are given in courts of law in accordance with the nature of the crime. If it is a minor offense, then the sentence is short, and in some cases the offense may be dismissed or only a very light sentence given. In God's divine court, the sins of a personal nature are often forgiven and sometimes lightly punished, Or the warning of a punishment may just be communicated, but there is also the promise of forgiveness. The most severe sins are those which relate to the rights of the creation of God, whether humans or animals, and the warning relating to these sins is severe, to protect the rights of humans, animals, and the surrounding environment in general. Then there is the punishment for those who reject belief once all the necessary conditions of legal responsibility have been fulfilled. The difference between this sin and the previous sins is that this sin is not one momentarily lived like the former sins. If a man disobeys God, surrendering to his desires and succumbs to drinking, that sin of drinking and subsequent intoxication is short-lived, and thus the punishment is not everlasting, if he is punished at all. Similarly, the sins relating to the rights of others are short-lived, and a person can be punished with a punishment that lasts long enough to mete out justice, and sometimes punishments that relate to the rights of others are recompensation in the form of deeds. The sin of disbelief after the generous conditions of responsibility have been met is different, because if the person were to live on earth forever, he would remain an unbeliever irrespective to whatever signs he witnessed. The eternal punishment is reserved for that group of people who, if they remained on earth forever, would remain unbelievers forever, and subsequently the punishment of the crime is forever. Additionally, if after witnessing the day of judgment and hell and everything else in the unseen realm, and were returned to earth, they would revert to unbelief. If anyone thought that such a group of people did not exist, then examine the statements of famous and notorious atheists, who boast that if they did meet a creator in the afterlife, they would denounce him and refuse to change. It is because of this obstinacy to belief and the desire to reject it at any cost that the punishment continues forever. The Quran describes a discussion between the unbelievers where God is mentioned. If you could but see when they are made to stand before the fire and will say, "Oh, would that we could be returned to life on earth, and not deny the signs of our Lord and be among the believers." Quran 6:27. This is what the unbelievers say when they see hell, but God goes on to say, "But what they concealed before has appeared to them, and even if they were returned, they would return to that which they were forbidden, and indeed they are liars." Quran 6:28. This is the reality of the unbeliever who is burned for eternity, once he chooses not to believe in the unseen realm and is returned back to earth. He will remain an unbeliever. We are informed by God in the Quran what they will admit. They will say, "Yes, a warner had come to us. But we denied and said, 'Allah has not sent down anything. You are not but in great error.' And they will say, 'If only we had been listening or reasoning, we would not be among the companions of the blaze." Quran 67, 9-10. 4.23. The punishment in hell. Is not the unbearable punishment in hell totally unnecessary? Such a misunderstanding is based on the idea that the human is punished in the next life with a body similar to the body he had on earth, when in reality the Quran and the prophetic reports mention that human bodies will be totally different and accord with the dimensions of the realm of the afterlife. Any attempt to create an analogy with our earthly bodies is bound to be limited. If bodily dimensions and characteristics of the bodies in the hereafter are different, it implies, too, that they are meet for punishment in accordance with the nature of the crime. As punishments on earth are difficult, but still endurable within the measure of the crime, so too are bodies in the afterlife. If a human body can stay in a prison cell in this life, desirable or not, so too can the body in the hereafter, which can stay in hell for the crime committed. It is not something to enjoy any more than a life sentence for murder is on earth, or for any other crimes. Therefore, when reading about hell, it should always be kept in mind that the realities and dimensions of those realms are different from what we are accustomed to on earth, and the punishment is proportionate to that realm. Conversely, the same is true regarding paradise and its enjoyments. 4.24 Euthyphro's Dilemma. Who determines what is good and bad? Often referred to as Euthyphro's dilemma, this problem is mentioned in Plato's Dialogues and relates to our discourse on the essence of goodness and badness, and may well be the source of the debate raised by the Mu'tazilite sect, to which the Sunni Kalam traditionalists responded. Socrates responds to Euthyphro on the nature of piety by asking his famous question, "Are the pious loved by the gods because they are pious, or they are pious because they are pious?" According to this problem, no normative term like good or pious can be defined since the rationalities differ, unless it is said that they have no rational justification. However, if the approval or command is rationally justified, then it is that rational justification that is the ultimate authority, and not the God who commands or approves. There are those things that can be deemed as good from their very essence, without any resort to other considerations like their relative or subjective nature. When we conceive anything, like existence for example, we naturally think of its opposite, which in this case would be non-existence. In the case of good, there will be its opposite, which is bad. Thus, we move to how we determine both good and bad. If goodness is innately good and does not require anyone to make it so, then that would mean that goodness is emanating from its own nature, without the creation of a maker who regulates it and makes it good. Rather, this would entail that innate good has an authority over the divine actions of God, his judgments and rulings, such values of goodness being the ultimate authority. This would also entail that no one has authority over the nature of good, because it emanates from its very own existence and has no recourse to a determiner, or anyone who modifies its values. The other possibility would be that good is determined by God and that he gives it the nature of goodness, according to his divine knowledge, wisdom, mercy, and whatever he wills. This would mean that values and goodness do not emanate on their own, and nothing can be deemed good or bad by its nature. In other words, that which is deemed good, bad, or evil is not due to its essence, but the result of various incidental or accidental considerations through its relation to other things, all of which God creates. Muslims, of course, take the latter view in that it is God who determines what is good and bad. Human reasoning alone is insufficient in determining the goodness or badness of something. The actions we make and observe in others can be described as good, or its opposite, bad or corrupt. But that description is due to external factors and other considerations like social interactions that demand a specific way of interaction. Certain cultures, for instance, may deem a specific action bad, while others deem it good. Driving up a one-way road is deemed bad in some places, and deemed absolutely fine and good in other places. Sometimes a thing may be deemed as good because of the good effects it leaves behind, while at other times it may be deemed bad because of the bad effects it leaves behind. At times, something can be deemed as good when coupled with one thing, and deemed bad when coupled with another on various counts. At other times, something is described as good because of the benefits it brings to others, like knowledge, and at other times deemed bad, like ignorance. Then again, another person can believe ignorance is bliss. Lying is deemed a social ill because of the harm it brings. Yet some people will deem it good when it is used to save a human life, for example, or considered acceptable in a unique situation. Likewise, things that are deemed good or bad vary according to social interaction and how specific benefits, cultures, and habits are considered, not to mention the nature of the people and how they consider specific things themselves. In like manner, some foods are deemed good and others bad, according to custom and taste. Some people in the Far East eat dogs, rats, bats, and a variety of other creatures considered horrendous to eat in other places. When the intellect judges such things as being good or bad, it does so under the influence of social factors or taste, and a variety of other influences. This is why people have disagreements on judgments pertaining to what is deemed good or bad. So far, it can be agreed that humans differ regarding the good or bad nature of something for a variety of considerations, but that if there is a divine reality, God, then He alone can determine for us what is to be good or bad, and yet at the same time, there are many things that are deemed good or bad universally. Such universal good or bad, it is claimed, is not dependent on other factors, but rather stands independently with its good or bad nature. Like the goodness of justice, the badness of oppression, or like the goodness of thanking the one who does you a favor, or saving someone from drowning. It is claimed after this that if God were wholly good and morally perfect, then His divine actions and commands must be in accordance with that which is innately good. Otherwise His divine perfection is undermined, an impossibility according to the nature of God. This reasoning would lead one to think that God can only do that which is deemed as universally good and perfect, in compliance with His perfect nature, and that the mind is sufficient in determining what is universally good and bad, even though the latter is full of contradictions. For example, as cannibalism in some human tribes is deemed good, the intellect alone is insufficient in determining the badness of cannibalism, as the tribe members would deem it good. The Sunni Kalam tradition responds to this by saying that the mind is not independent in determining absolute good and bad, and therefore is in need of guidance that informs which actions are rewardable and which actions are punishable in the afterlife. The personal convictions of the intellect in determining what is good or bad are insufficient in any ruling on God's judgments, as things are not good or bad independently from God who created them. This is also because that which is described as good or bad, when it was created, could have taken either of those adjectives, showing that the essence of something is different from its adjective. As God creates things as good or bad, then those things are prone to change by the one who created them, and He is the one who determines their nature. Thus, things are neither good nor bad due to their essence. Actions have no goodness or badness in themselves. They are just described as such through the accidentals associated with them. Society as a whole and the parts that make up that whole is not dissimilar to an instrument composed of numerous functioning parts. The value of the whole is taken from these integrated components. The value of actions within society is known to God. Even if people formed a consensus and decided that a specific action was good, it would not make that action good. The wrong action can be deemed good, like eugenics, racism, ethnic cleansing, or many other monstrosities. Recent history illustrates this, particularly the Holocaust in Hitler's Germany, or the Bolshevik slaughter. Even actions that seem outwardly good in a universal sense can be deceiving. There are many lessons on how the human mind without God's guidance can misjudge a situation. 4.25. The Drowning Man. A person is drowning in a river and calling for help. You observe that a second man jumping into the river to rescue the drowning person. Ostensibly, the man has performed a universally praiseworthy action. Such an action can, however, have many possibilities according to its inner realities. One scenario could be that the man saved the drowning person for no ulterior motive other than for the sake of God, and purely with a sincere intention, not seeking worldly praise. Another scenario of the same action could be that he saved the drowning person solely for the praise of people, an ostentatious move done in order to be seen to be a hero. But let us suppose that the man who jumped in to save the drowning person did so in the pitch dark when no one was around, diminishing the possibility of him doing it for ostentatious reasons. The response is that it could still have been the case that the man jumped into the river to save the person, despite the fact that no one was around to observe his heroics, with the sole intention that the saved person would tell others who would subsequently praise him, or even merely doing it for the praise of the drowning person. A third scenario could see the man jumping into the river to save the drowning person, not apparently for the praise of the drowning person or of others, but rather for a deeper psychological motive in which the subconscious association of saving the person, even though he is not necessarily cognizant of such an ulterior motive, is still linked to his action being lauded. Imam al-Ghazali termed this kind of subconscious mental association, centuries before the likes of Pavlov, as preceding conception by inverse, sabq at-tasawwur ila al-aqs. Even if this natural, subconscious motive is not found, the man who jumps into the river to save the person did so because he reflected that if the situation were reversed, and no one tried to save him, that would be a disaster. That alone would incite him to save the drowning person. If the man jumped into the river with no motive at all, it would be deemed as stupidity and an attempted suicide. Strange as they may seem, these scenarios demonstrate that an action deemed universally good can have many realities, and the only one who can determine what is truly good or bad is God. Numerous other human actions, seemingly good, become entangled in this way, and one realizes that there is no way the mind is free to determine the true merits of those actions. Such a propensity to mistaken judgment indicates the human need for divine help. In exactly the same way the intellect will fall short of understanding the full picture, and mistake God and his divine judgments regarding suffering, God tells us, "But perhaps you hate a thing and it is good for you, and perhaps you love a thing and it is bad for you, and Allah knows while you know not." Quran 2:216. 4.26. God's Law. Why do we need law? Why didn't God just create us and leave us to our own lawmaking? This question supposes a primal cause that creates everything and leaves us to our own devices. This would then mean that man could devise his own laws to govern in the way man pleases. The problem with this is that it would mean that everyone will give his own opinion regarding the status quo, which already happens, like deciding the appropriate punishment of murder with intent, or in what instances capital punishment was justified. Is euthanasia or abortion justified in any circumstances? These problems, and many similar types of problems, can only be resolved by a divine law. Divinely revealed law sets parameters on what should be deemed morally and ethically acceptable. What it seemingly leaves out allows for differences of opinion upon those things not deemed immutable. The scope for juristic difference and discretional laws is left open, which is quite vast, and in each field of jurisprudence, many man-made laws are permitted or adapted, as long as the fundamentals are not altered or corrupted, since they govern the essential preservation of human civilization. These preserves of the divinely revealed law are referred to as the objectives of Sharia law, maqasid al-Sharia, which aim to preserve the faith, life, sanity, wealth, progeny, and reputation of all citizens. Each objective comes with necessities, essentials, and additional luxuries. For instance, life has necessities, then essentials, and then luxuries. And so too legal objectives. These objectives are ordered in priority, and each one is prioritized in accordance with its specific order. If any of the objectives clash, then the necessity of the first objective is prioritized, then the necessity of the next, and then of the next, and so on. If the necessity of any one of the 6 objectives clashes with the essentials or luxuries of any other objectives, then priority is always given to the necessities. In the case of a clash between essentials and luxuries, then the essentials are always given priority over luxuries, irrespective of the other objectives. An example of a necessity is the need to eat the bare minimum to stay alive, while the essential aspect is eating wholesome foods regularly, and a luxury would be eating delicacies. The divinely revealed law will prioritize these things in this order. Atheists and non-Muslims generally object to the Sharia in particular, some referring to the divine law as a celestial North Korean ordination, promoting genocide, infanticide, abuse, slavery, annexation, plunder, witch-burning, torture, and rape. Aside from hasty generalizations and superficial knowledge of what the Sharia actually is, politically motivated events and groups, drawing on selective history, cultures, and sociological factors, often compound their misconceived ideas with the divinely revealed law and valid hermeneutics of the Quran and prophetic traditions. These fallacies and objections will be covered in Chapter 6. What should be noted at the moment is that humanity has been endowed with intellectual prowess and abilities that exceed those of other creatures in the animal kingdom. What God has bestowed, atheists will assert that nature or Darwinian evolution has given them by natural selection. Abilities like rational thought, abstraction, logic, mathematics, reasoning, and understanding. Everything that man has used to subjugate the earth and its natural resources, constructing roads into and under mountains, inventing satellites, airplanes, and many other forms of transport. The intellect and free will given to man has seen almost everything subjugated to humanity. With no divinely revealed law, humankind would only make its own tyrannical laws permitting men to destroy, pillage, rape, and plunder, without any true guidance. Even the gross misinterpretations of God's divinely revealed law are humankind's doing. If human beings are left to their own laws and devices, without a divinely revealed law and without the odd intervention of God-created disasters, deaths, pestilence, disease, and other created natural occurrences, the individual can easily become a tyrant who claims divinity for himself. In ancient times, Pharaoh and Nimrod, and today countless despots, lined up to promote tyranny. Man has always been in need of spiritual and legal guidance to fulfill his role as the caretaker on earth. This responsibility to be the caretaker of the earth during our short-lived existence means that man ordinarily can take benefit from the earth and its natural resources without restraint. Man has this responsibility within the divinely revealed law, by which God sets out the main principles for man to follow. God in his wisdom knows how to provide, to whom, and in the proportion known only to him. This is why God says in the Quran, if Allah had extended provision for his servants, they would have committed tyranny throughout the earth. But he sends down in an amount which he wills. Indeed, he is, of his servants, acquainted and seeing. Quran 42:27. 4.27. An Imperfect World. Some people like to point to the imperfections in the world or anything that seems purposeless, ignoring the many things that have a deep complex meaning, which would make those imperfections pale into insignificance. During the early period of Darwinian evolution theory, scientists were of the opinion that there were many vestigial organs that had no function. As science advanced, however, the functions of many of those organs were discovered. This is the nature of science, and the hasty generalizations of atheist polemics towards God creating an imperfect world is one of them. Such a person is like a man who walks into a building and observes the architecture, the embellishment and decoration, and the many functions of various parts of the building along with its furniture, but then sees a nail protruding from one of the walls which seemingly has no function, on sight of which he exclaims, "I know there is no architect for this building, because there are things in here that have inherent flaws and design imperfections." In doing so, he ignores everything else he has observed or gives it some fantastic explanation. God has created this world as a temporary stopover for humanity. The world is like a train station where passengers wait for a short while, and then they are transported to another destination. There are many things God has created for the use of man and creatures, with man having the additional gifts of intellect and free will, by which he gains the responsibility for being a caretaker on earth the short time he is here. There are sufficient resources for everyone on earth, but mismanagement allows those resources to be plundered and depleted by all alike. It is man's doing that millions of tons of food are wasted every year, or millions of gallons of milk thrown into the seas, despite people starving as a result of man-made famines. It is man's doing that there are wars and nuclear weapons, and other weapons that maim and dismember. Chemical weapons are man's doing. Loans to already exploited and plundered countries in the abused world with high interest rates are man's doing. Cutting down the Amazon, the world's lungs, is man's doing. Political and sectarian violence is man's doing. Extremist ideologies and misinterpretations of holy books is man's doing. Poisoning the air, destroying the ozone layer, global warming and melting the ice caps, polluting the seas and biosphere, are all man's doing. Exploiting politics, religion, the church, money and the economy, orphans, children, widows, and the vulnerable, are similarly all man's doing. Causing unnecessary homelessness, poverty, illnesses, and various other evils. Just extend the list. In fact, the various objections against God seem insignificant when compared with the human evil that human free will permits. People complain about God creating natural disasters, but fail to remember that 99% and more of the time when there are no natural disasters, and the fact that God has given us an earth which is inhabitable and good for most of the time for the most of humanity, and that the majority of the evil in the world is the doing of man who, albeit with a lifetime's responsibility, was given intellect, reasoning, and free will. This is why God says in the Quran, "Corruption has spread on land and sea as a result of what people's hands have done, so that Allah may cause them to taste the consequences of some of their deeds, and perhaps they might return to the right path." Quran 30:41. The rule, as outlined by God Himself, is that whatever may happen to humanity through His decree, and without human choice, the outcome will always be good. Humans not having complete knowledge of the whole are unable to comprehend the divine wisdom straight away, and indeed sometimes not at all, that is, until the afterlife. Human actions that are evil, on the other hand, are different. God cannot be described as evil, as the very meaning of evil is to undermine and violate that which does not belong to the one doing the violating. This cannot be the case with God, as He, unlike humanity, owns and creates everything. God says regarding the outcome of human evil, "Whatever good befalls you is from God, and whatever evil befalls you is from yourself. We have sent you, O prophet, as a messenger to all people, and God is sufficient as a witness." Quran 479. 4.28. What is the wisdom of God creating evil? God creates everything, which includes the human free will, and He knows what people will do with that free will. Yet God does not always intervene in the evil actions of others. Additionally, God will allow disasters, pestilence, diseases, earthquakes, volcanoes, and other events beyond the scope of human autonomy. With regard to human actions, a distinction should be made between the divine will and that which God is pleased with. Not everything is pleasing to God. The will of God relates to what God creates. If Zayd decides to pray with his own free will, then this action of praying is an action that Zayd has acquired through his free will, which has been created by the will of God. And when Zayd decides to pray, God creates that action for him, once Zayd has made the choice and carries through with the intention. On the other hand, if Zayd decides not to pray, then Zayd is exercising his free will to abandon a particular action by choice, also possible within the divine will, even though it might provoke the displeasure of God. This summarizes the acute distinction between the divine will and the divine pleasure. Similarly, a distinction between the divine knowledge of how things will be and then the subsequent creation of those things must be kept in mind. If God knows that Zayd throughout his life will consume 20,000 chapati flatbreads, this knowing must be held distinct from the fact that when Zayd is born and grows into adulthood, and subsequently throughout his life eats those chapatis, this knowing relates not only to the creation of Zayd, but also the creation of those chapatis and the means and free will by which Zayd consumes them. If Zayd makes the decision to kill Bakr using a gun, Zayd will make this decision with his own free will. God knows the motives of Zayd and creates within him the ability to do what Zayd wants to do, and this is the meaning of God's will, while Zayd has the free will to choose that action. When Zayd fires the bullet into Bakr and the bullet pierces the skin causing bleeding, if God ordains for Bakr's soul to be removed, then it is God's will that Bakr dies, even though the responsibility lies with Zayd's action. This is similar to someone drinking poison. If God wills, He can stop the effect of the poison, and if He wills, He will create the killing effect in the poison. Since everything happens by the will and might of God, Zayd, however, will be responsible for his action, the product of his own free will, that of firing the bullet. For that he will be accountable to God on the day of judgment. The question may be asked, why doesn't God intervene when humans commit evil like Zayd's decision to kill? The response is that God has intervened many times, not least in creating the means by which much human evil is deterred. And even if God did not intervene directly at that particular point of the action, if the entire picture were presented, including the outcome of the victim and the perpetrator, it would make much more sense. This is why the day of judgment and the afterlife is a rational necessity. For if it were not, good and bad would be equal. Evil people who have committed monstrosities would die, and if there were no afterlife, it would mean that they had been acquitted, effectively amounting to there being no difference between good and bad. Logically, atheism is the rejection of any good or bad, with the underlying motivation for atheists being self-benefit, self-interest, averting any harm to oneself, and avoiding trouble for the sake of self-preservation. In fact, some atheists would have no real hesitation in committing evil actions if they could be sure of no backlash, like some hypocritical, pretentious, and self-righteous theists do. Further to the point regarding divine intervention into acts of human evil through their own volition, is that if God intervened at every point humans decided to carry out evil, then there would be no free will and there would be no meaning to someone being legally responsible. For that reason, there is an afterlife and a day of judgment when human injustices will be rectified, although in many instances, people will still be rewarded and blessed on earth, while others will be punished or chastened prior to dying. God mentions why he does not intervene in many human choices when he says, "Had your Lord so willed, O prophet, all people on earth would have certainly believed, every single one of them. Would you then force people to become believers?" Quran 1099. God also mentions how the believer can be rewarded on earth also, so that people do not doubt that goodness reaps worldly fruits. Whoever does good, whether male or female, and is a believer, we will surely bless them with a good life, and we will certainly reward them according to the best of their deeds. Quran 1697. The condition for any action to be accepted is that it be done solely for the sake of God and not for any ulterior motive. Whenever luxury or a worldly life is condemned in the Quran, it is in the context of greed, selfishness, corruption, and harmful attachment to material wealth. How often do people comment on Muslims who perpetrate evil and not give charity, being shown up by non-Muslims who do charitable and humanitarian acts, yet all the while the Muslims believing they will have salvation and the others not? Surely it is impossible to disregard good humanitarians like Princess Diana and Mother Teresa. The response is quite simple in regard to specific individuals, since we cannot know their individual judgment and can only go by what is apparent. A Muslim who does evil acts might only nominally be a Muslim, or a hypocrite who just shows an outward adherence to faith. As for good actions, they are only accepted by God in the hereafter if they are done purely for his sake, and not for any ulterior motive. This would require correct faith in God and acting piously solely for his sake. An action which outwardly is pious but inwardly corrupt would not be accepted from a Muslim. Princess Diana and Mother Teresa did many humanitarian works, but did they do them for God or another motive? If it were for any other purpose, then there is no reward with God. Did the two die with correct beliefs and faith? Only God knows. Only he can judge individuals, and we as Muslims must content ourselves with supplicating for those who outwardly profess Islam, even though the realities of individuals are known solely to God. The only way to determine whether a specific human action is evil is by resorting to divine revelation first, prior to intellect, customs, and society. Man is raised in nobility when he spurns base desires and chooses what is moral, ethical, angelic, and good. This, and this alone, is what raises the status of man. God says in the Quran, "Indeed, we have honored the children of Adam, carried them on land and sea, granted them good and lawful provisions, and privileged them far above many of our creatures." Quran 1770. This is the very purpose and meaning of legal responsibility, nobility gained when a person has the option of doing the opposite. For instance, if someone is praised for their generosity, they are only praised because they could have been miserly. If someone does not have to fight the desire to be stingy, their generosity is not praiseworthy. These choices will be taken into account on the day of judgment, and we humans will never have access to the full picture or the divine wisdom behind events. If Zayd had not killed Bakr, then Bakr would have lived on to do what? Only God knows. In summary, the main response with regard to human evil and God-created disasters and what atheists deem as evil is where God says of himself, he cannot be questioned about what he does, but they will all be questioned. An 21:23. This is because the actions of God are not the same as the actions of creation. They are not the same, and to equate the two is incommensurable. This also implies that everything around us belongs to Allah. If a person says, "Why has God removed my eyesight?" the answer is that it never belonged to you, but belonged to God, as to him belongs everything. In what he gives or takes, there will always be a divine wisdom, whether we know it or not. Secondly, God states, "Verily, your Lord is the doer of what he wills." An 11:107. God is not compelled to do what humans want from him or what we deem as good. Goodness is, in reality, created by God and not the other way around. If God manifests himself as the one who harms, he cannot be described as an oppressor or evildoer because, as we have seen, the meaning of oppression is the taking away of the right, property, or anything else that does not belong to the oppressor. If a person kills another person, he is taking away something that did not belong to him. If someone beats up another person, he would have violated the rights of another that do not belong to himself. This cannot apply to God since everything belongs to him. So when God takes the souls of people and creates death, this cannot be described as oppression, simply because these souls and lives belong to God. God could destroy everything on earth, and it would not be evil or oppression. If Allah were to punish people immediately for their wrongdoing, he would not have left a single living being on earth. But he delays them for an appointed term, and when their time arrives, they cannot delay it for a moment, nor can they advance it. An 16:61. If God had not created any suffering on earth, many more would have claimed divinity. It is said regarding the Pharaoh of the Exodus, who some believe to have been Ramses II, that he never suffered a headache or any illnesses, and this led him to think of himself as divine. If humanity were not limited by suffering, the human being would have no restrictions to the evil he willingly perpetrates. If people suffer no problems, they can become very arrogant or contract spiritual ailments. God created things around us in such a way that we as human beings can subdue elephants and lions. But a weak creature like the mosquito can give us malaria. We can make the tiger afraid so that he avoids our villages out of fear of humans. Yet the household fly, we can scarcely repel or catch when it flies in our face. God creates disease and pestilence to manifest human limitations. Earthquakes happen very rarely, most of the time the earth being still and tranquil. Yet from time to time God allows the tectonic plates to move and causes earthquakes which lead to people dying and suffering. These also serve to show our human role as caretakers of the earth, and that we have a Lord who sees everything. One of the main lessons in all of this is the passing life of this world and a preparation for the next. This life is like an airport we are passing through and not the final destination. If God had not created this world with imperfections, suffering, and other problems, then humans would become too attached to this worldly life and would not want to leave it. What suffering could be worse than leaving a perfect world? If the world were perfect, and God had created it perfect, the atheist would be asking why we have to leave such a perfect world, and why God was limiting our free will by intervening and preventing evil. God has created the imperfections and suffering in this world, and we will surely test you with something of fear and hunger and a loss of wealth and lives and fruits. But give good tidings to the patient who, when disaster strikes them, say, "Indeed, we belong to Allah, and indeed to Him we will return." Quran 2, 155 to 156. When the believer responds by affirming that everything belongs to God, he knows that God gives and takes as He wills, and that the return for everyone is back to God from this temporary abode. God says, "O humanity, indeed, you are laboring restlessly towards your Lord, and will eventually meet the consequences." Quran 84:6. God says, "No disaster strikes upon the earth or among yourselves, except that it is in a register before we bring it into being. Indeed that, for Allah, is easy, in order that you not despair over what has eluded you, and not exult in pride over what He has given you. And Allah does not like everyone self-deluded and boastful." Quran 57:22 to 23.